Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day, where we will be discussing Federalist number 34, of course, by Alexander Hamilton. Yet again, we'll be getting back to James Madison fairly soon. Thank you for coming. I'm Marcy. Hi, everyone popping in live. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a little while since I made a video. I'm making some adjustments in my personal life. A little bit of a career change going on here. I'll talk about that a little bit at the end if you want, and I'm going to release a video over the next few days elaborating on just how that will affect Founder of the Day. As for now, don't worry, we will be doing our Federalist Tuesdays for whatever 85 minus number 34 weeks is. What is that, 50 something? We got another year to go. So without further ado, let's get right into it. We're going to pop over to the big board over here and start reading about Federalist number 34. The same subject continued yet again for several weeks. Hi TJ, thank you for coming. Same subject continued concerning the general power of taxation for the Daily Advertiser, January 4th, 1788. Alex, thank you so much. Everyone popping in. How are you guys doing? It's been a while, like I said. Sorry I missed last week. We'll be getting right into it here. I'm going to roll up my sleeves and really get into it. As always, if you want to read along, you can look at the screen or check out the link in the description below to read it yourself. With that, we're going to scroll down here, as always, to the people of the state of New York. What does Hamilton have to say now about taxation? One sentence at a time, we're going to decode this old-timey language. I flatter myself. Let me say this again. These are his capitals, not mine, so I really want to emphasize that. I flatter myself it has been clearly shown in my last number that the particular states under the proposed constitution would have co-equal authority with the Union in the article of revenue, except as to duties on imports. So what he's saying here is, since you read my last paper, you obviously agree with me that the powers of taxation will be shared by the federal government and the state governments, except on duties on imports. And I do always want to note that even the Anti-Federalist agreed that imports should be left to the federal government, if not the Continental Congress or a new government. That should be shared. They didn't have a problem with that necessarily, nor did most of them have it with Britain, though we're not going to get off into that debate right now. Continuing. As this leaves open to the states far the greatest part of the resources of the community, there can be no color for the assertion that they would not possess means as abundant as could be desired for the supply of their own wants, independent of all external control. So here he's saying, if you really look at it, since the states can tax whatever they want, then they should be able to raise funds to do whatever they want, and they will not be controlled by the federal government for this reason. Granted, in an earlier paper, Hamilton did note that the idea of concurrent jurisdiction, where both the federal and state governments could theoretically tax the same thing, and it would be nice if the state governments bowed out in favor of the national policy, as he capitalized when he wrote it. Continuing, that the field is sufficiently wide will more fully appear when we come to advert to the inconsiderable share of the public expenses for which it will fall to the lot of the state governments to provide. Here he's saying that the states can raise money taxing whatever they want, but we also need to look at the idea that many of the things the states currently pay for, they won't have to pay for. The federal government is going to start paying for things. That's why they need to raise taxes. And on top of that, that will save money for the states, making it even better for them. To argue upon abstract principles that this coordinate authority cannot exist is to set up a supposition in theory against fact and reality. So Hamilton's saying many anti-federalists think that you can't have both the taxes for the states and the federal government, but he says that's against both fact and reality. So let's see how he elaborates on this particular issue. However proper such reasonings might be to show that a thing ought not to exist, they are wholly to be rejected when they are made use of to prove that it does not exist contrary to the evidence of the fact itself. Okay, so that Alexander Hamilton twisty turning language here, saying, excuse me, the idea that something ought not to exist, something that came up a lot at the time. An anti-federalist might be able to demonstrate why they think this power of taxation from the federal government ought not to exist, but when you look at the things itself, that isn't necessarily the case, according to Hams. Oh, excuse me. It is well known that in the Roman Republic, the legislative authority in the last resort resided for ages in two different political bodies, not as branches of the same legislature, but as distinct and independent legislatures, in each of which an opposite interest prevailed, in one the patrician, in other the plebeian. So he's saying here, if you look at ancient Rome, look, they had two separate republics. It wasn't a big deal. Or two separate legislatures. They had one for the wealthy elites and one for the everyday person. Many arguments might have been adduced to prove the unfitness of two such seemingly contradictory authorities, each having power to annul or repeal the acts of the other. So you could look at how there are these two legislatures, and that doesn't make sense, and that could go really poorly. But a man would have been regarded as frantic who should have attempted at Rome to disprove of their existence. So you might not like that, you might think it was a little contradictory. They might be at odds to have these two separate governments at the same time, but they did. His point is, they did. Okay? It will be readily understood that I allude to the Comitia Centrata and the Comitia Tributa. I believe those are the names of the two governments. I don't speak ancient Roman. I apologize. The former, in which the people voted by centuries, was so arranged as to give a superiority to the patrician interests. In the latter, in which numbers prevailed, the plebeian interest had an entire predominancy. So again, he's kind of repeating himself. These two separate governments, one was for the wealthy elite and one was for the everyday person. Here we go, no big deal. And yet, these two legislatures coexisted for ages. Then the Roman Republic attained to the utmost height of human greatness. So despite this seemingly awkward scenario, ancient Rome survived for a long time. I'm going to scroll right past that little advertisement. I forgot that ads sometimes pop up on my website. Whoopsie daisy. In the case particularly under consideration, there is no such contradiction as appears in the example cited. There is no power on either side to annul the acts of the other. So, when we're discussing the United States Constitution as opposed to ancient Rome, these two separate governments are not at odds with each other. One can't cancel the other, according to Hamilton. Though he doesn't use the word superior in this sentence, many Anti-Federalists would bring up that supremacy clause. And in practice, there is little reason to apprehend any inconvenience because, in a short course of time, the wants of the states will naturally reduce themselves within a very narrow compass. And in the interim, the United States will, and in all probability, find it convenient to abstain wholly from those objects to which the particular states would be inclined to resort. So, what Hamilton's saying here is, as time progresses under the United States Constitution, the states are going to have very particular things they want to do. And the federal government, in all probability, will steer clear of the things the states want to do. Maybe one day the federal government will impede on what the states want to do, but for the next few decades, it, in all probability, will not. Okay. To form a more precise judgment of the true merits of this question, it will be well to advert to the proportion between the objects that will require a federal provision in respect to revenue and those which will require a state provision. So, to look more closely at this discussion, the difference between the federal and state ability to tax the people and what the state will actually need to fund and do, let's take a more specific look. We shall discover that the former are altogether unlimited, and that the latter are circumscribed within very moderate bounds. So we will see that the federal government has unlimited provisions in respect to revenue, but the states have very specific things, as he said earlier. Although now he's not just saying that the states only need to do specific things, now he's saying under the Constitution, the states can only do specific things. And I will also remind you, this is before the Bill of Rights, so it's before the 10th Amendment that specifically leaves anything not specifically written in the Constitution to the states or the people themselves. And now we'll also remind you Hamilton was not a fan of the Bill of Rights. Continuing. In pursuing this inquiry, we must bear in mind that we are not to confine our view to the present period, but look forward to remote futurity. So while we're doing this, keep in mind, we're not just talking about right now, 1787, or January 4th, 1788. We are looking to future generations. So Hamilton is about to essentially talk about how the states and federal government should interact with each other nowadays when we're alive, right now in modern times. Marcy Wu, Hamilton is my idol. Well, we have a bit of a disagreement there. You come to the right place. We're going to learn a lot about Hamilton's politics, but I like to tease him a lot on this channel. It's Allie Hams really gets a good push around in this particular channel. Constitutions of civil government are not to be framed upon a calculation of existing exigencies. If you're new to the channel, that is one of the few words I never pronounce correctly, and he says it twice in this sentence. Constitutions of civil government are not to be framed upon a calculation of existing exigencies, but upon a combination of these with the probable exigencies of ages according to the natural and tried course of human affairs. So he's saying here, when we look at the United States Constitution, we can't just look at how it's going to affect us now. We need to look at the long term. We want this Constitution to survive. And as much trouble as I give Alexander Hamilton, with one major hiccup along the way, the United States Constitution has survived for 250 years, and that is a pretty impressive feat. Nothing, therefore, can be more fallacious than to infer the extent of any power proper to be lodged in the national government from an estimate of its immediate necessities. Here he's saying we can't just look at what we're doing now. He's essentially repeating himself. We can't just look at what's important right now. What do we got to get done right now? We need to really look for the long-term future. There ought to be a capacity to provide for future contingencies as they may happen. And as these are illimitable in their nature, it is impossible to safely limit that capacity. So we need to prepare for the future forever. But we can't know what's going to happen in the future forever. So since we need to have the capacity or the ability to handle any problems that might arise, we can't limit the government's abilities now. Excuse me. It is true, perhaps, that a computation might be made with sufficient accuracy to answer the purpose of the quantity of revenue requisite to discharge the subsisting engagements of the Union, and to maintain those establishments which, for some time to come, would suffice in times of peace. So, we could figure out how much money we need right now. And we could put a system in place to raise the amount of money we need right now. And we could predict for a few years, even a decade or two into the future, the money we might need. So long as there's no war. But, where's the end of this sentence? Oh, he's going to ask himself a question. Hamilton loves asking himself questions. But, would it be wise, or would it not rather be the extreme of folly, to stop at this point and to leave the government entrusted with the care of the national defense in a state of absolute incapacity to provide for the protection of the community against future invasions of public peace by foreign wars or domestic convulsions? So he's asking, would it be smart to just simply say, this is the money we have to run the government. If there's a war that comes up, we haven't budgeted for that, and there's no change we can make. If, On the contrary, we ought to exceed this point. Where can we stop? Short of an indefinite power of providing for emergencies as they may arise. So, if we do overspend our limits, if we do accept that there might be wars, we might need to change budgets, well, how do we plan on how much we can raise in those times of emergency? How many emergencies do we get to raise money for? Things of that nature. Okay, where's the other sentence? Though it is easy to assert in general terms the possibility of forming a rational judgment of a due provision against probable dangers, yet we may safely challenge those who make the assertion to bring forward their data, and may affirm that they would be found as vague and uncertain as any that would be produced to establish the probable duration of the world. So, it's easy for us to figure out what we need in the next few decades. It might even be easy for us to figure out ahead of time what we would need to spend to fight in a war. But when people bring forward this data, when people tell us this is what we need, we would also have to note that it's probably vague. It's a guess, because we don't know who's going to invade us. We don't know which British Navy, French Navy, Spanish Navy, the Dutch. I mean, one day maybe China. They were trading with China at that point. You know, there's nothing, I guess that's a tough modern example. I didn't mean it like that. And what about India? They were trading spices in India at that point. So we don't know where it's coming from. We don't know how much we'd have to spend or what they're sending at us, and especially into the future. Again, he's talking about the future. So he's like acknowledging like World Wars 1 and 2. He doesn't know what's coming. He certainly doesn't know some of the weaponry that would come around. So how are they supposed to plan in 1860s, in 1788? How are they supposed to plan to budget to build nuclear weapons? Is essentially the point he's making here. Again, he is assuming through previous Federalist papers that you've already come around and agree with him on not only the need to give the federal government power of taxation, but the main reason to do that is to raise a powerful army. So we must assume we already agree with him. Observations confined to the mere prospect of internal attacks can deserve no weight, though even these will admit of no satisfactory calculation. But if we mean to be a commercial people, it must form a part of our policy to be able one day to defend that commerce. So not only do we have to plan for attacks, either revolutions from within or attacks from foreign nations, but we also have to, if we want to trade on the high seas in perpetuity, we must defend our ships on those high seas. The support of a navy and of naval wars would involve contingencies that must baffle all the efforts of political arithmetic. So we just can't budget for that kind of thing, he is telling us. Admitting that we ought to try the novel and absurd experiment in politics of tying up the hands of government from offensive war founded upon reasons of state, yet certainly we ought not to disable it from guarding the community against the ambition or enmity of other nations. Another word I have trouble pronouncing. Words that start with E's are trouble for me. Admitting that we ought to try the novel and absurd. So I'll grant you, as crazy as it sounds, that, okay, everyone else seems to want to make sure we can't just go starting wars for no reason around the world, and I'll give you that, I guess, is Hamilton's point of view, not mine. Yet we cannot disable it from preventing wars that are started against us for no reason. A cloud has been for some time hanging over the European world. So Europe was always ready to go to wars, and this is just another time where Europe might go to a war. If it should break forth into a storm, who can ensure us that in its progress a part of its fury would not be spent upon us? So if Europe does go to war, how are we to assume that Europe doesn't, one of those European nations doesn't decide to come take North America? No reasonable man would hastily pronounce that we are entirely out of its reach. So that's everyone would probably agree, even back then. Europe could just kind of show up one day on their boats and come take us. It's happened before. Or, if the combustible materials that now seem to be collecting should be dissipated without coming to maturity, or if a flame should be kindled without extending to us, what security can we have that our tranquility will long remain undisturbed from some other cause or from some other quarter? So even if Europe goes to war and they don't drag us into the war, what's to make us think that another part of the world isn't going to show up and drag us into a different war? Let us recollect that peace or war will not always be left to our option, that however moderate or unambitious we may be, we cannot count upon the moderation or hope to extinguish the ambition of others. So even if we're being super cool about it, it doesn't mean other nations around the world are going to be super cool about it. Nations like to start wars. Who could have imagined at the conclusion of the last war that France and Britain, wearied and exhausted as they both were, would soon have looked with so hostile an aspect upon each other? So, remember, Britain and France were both part of the American Revolutionary War. They went to war with each other. That's the thing. When France joined the Revolutionary War, they weren't like, we're going to help America fight off Britain. They were like, we're going to fight Britain around the world again. And it would happen multiple times thereafter. But either way, they were exhausted from the war, from the American Revolution that broke out into a world war. Yet they still, at this time in 1788, were just about ready to go to war with each other again. Why would they want to do that? Because nations like war. To judge from the history of mankind, we shall be compelled to conclude that the fiery and destructive passions of war reign in the human breast with much more powerful sway than the mild and beneficent sentiments of peace, and that to model our political systems upon speculations of lasting tranquility is to calculate on the weaker springs of the human character. This is Hamilton delivering a hard truth. People are violent and aggressive, and nations are the same. Nations go to war, and they always have, and as much as we'd like to have peace, world or peace for all eternity, that is not really an objective way to look at history. That's just not how it goes down. And to assume that if we're being peaceful and cool, all the other nations are going to be peaceful and cool with us. One of those fair points Hamilton makes every once in a while. What are the chief sources of expense in every government? So we're moving on here to, okay, back to the costing us money. Now that we've established wars will happen and we need to be ready for that, what are the chief sources of expenses in a government? What costs money? What has occasioned that enormous accumulation of debts with which several of the European nations are impressed? So what has it that caused all these European nations to be deeply in debt? And wink, wink, all the American states to be so deeply in debt at the time? The answer plainly is wars and rebellions. The support of those institutions which are necessary to guard the body politic against these two most mortal diseases of society, wars and rebellions. He always likes to bring in the rebellions, despite having just participated in one. He very much doesn't like what Daniel Shays was doing in Massachusetts. Okay. The expenses arising from those institutions which are relative to the mere domestic police of a state, to the support of its legislative, executive, and judicial departments, with their different appendages, and to the encouragement of agriculture and manufactures, which will comprehend almost all the objects of state expenditure, are insignificant in comparison with those related to national defense. So, of all these expenses, it costs money to run the government, all the branches of government, domestic policing, so suppressing internal rebellions, agriculture, business, which he notes that agriculture and business, that's what we're going to leave to the states. The beginning of this paper was about what the states get to do, and he kind of quickly says, that's what you guys get to do. Agriculture and manufacturing. But he makes a rightful point here that they're insignificant compared to national defense. That's what costs the most money. All right, here we go. In the Kingdom of Great Britain, where all the ostentatious apparatus of monarchy is to be provided for, not above a 15th part of the annual income of the nation is appropriated to the class of expense last mentioned. The other 14/15ths are absorbed in the payment of interest of debts contracted for carrying on the wars in which the country has been engaged, and in maintenance of the fleets and armies. So, taking a look at Great Britain, 14/15ths, a vast majority. What is that? If it were 90-something% of the finances of Great Britain are paying off debts that were incurred simply for wars. Where does this sentence end? Holy moly. I probably went too far. We'll see. If, on the one hand, it should be observed that the expenses incurred in the prosecution of the ambitious enterprises and vainglorious pursuits of a monarchy are not a proper standard by which to judge those which might be necessary in a republic, it ought, on the other hand, to be remarked that there should be as great a disproportion between the profusion and extravagance of a wealthy kingdom in its domestic administration and the frugality and economy in which that particular government become the modest simplicity of republican government. It's a mouthful. I really like the word vainglorious. I've never seen the word vainglorious before. Really, I've read these papers a while ago. But I've never seen it in modern use, that's for sure. So, we're saying here, if you look and see, the monarchy in Great Britain being super vainglorious and trying to make themselves look good and kind of wasting money, and they're still spending all this money on the army. Now, what if a frugal republic like the United States, trying to be more simple, not wasting money on a monarch, just trying to be prideful, doing exactly the opposite? How much of our budget is going to go to that? Even more than 14/15ths, one would presume Hamilton is alluding to. If we balance a proper deduction from one side against that which it is supposed ought to be made from the other, the proportion may still be considered as holding good. I'm not sure what he means by holding good. That sounds like an old-timey term I'm not familiar with. But basically what he's saying here is what he said in the last sentence. You look at this situation, we're going to be spending a lot of money on keeping ourselves funded. Take a quick sip of water here while we continue. But let us advert to the large debt which we ourselves contracted in a single war, and let us only calculate on a common share of the events which disturb the peace of nations, and we shall instantly perceive, without the aid of any elaborate illustration, that there must always be an immense disproportion between the objects of federal and state expenditures. So, again, what he was alluding to before, what I had mentioned before, look at the different states. Look at how much debt the states brought on themselves in just one war. And that's why there's going to be a huge difference in what the federal government has to spend money on in the states. The federal government is going to have to focus its money on that standing army. Hamilton is so pumped to get started. It is true that several of the states, separately, are encumbered with considerable debts, which are an excrescence of the late war. As I said, many of the states had a whole lot of debt. But this cannot happen again if the proposed system be adopted, and when these debts are discharged, the only call for revenue of any consequence which the state governments will continue to experience will be for the mere support of their respective civil list, to which, if we all add all contingencies, the total amount in every state ought to fall considerably short of £200,000. So, essentially saying here, federal government is going to raise all the money for the soldiers and the army and the navy. And the states don't have to do that anymore. It's going to free them up of the most expensive part of running a government. Therefore, now he's saying £200,000. We don't use pounds anymore. Their money's valued dramatically different today. I don't know what the conversion rate is, I'll be honest with you. But he's saying they shouldn't need a whole lot of money. You know, couple mil. It's like today if they're like, your state only needs a couple mil. Is more or less what he's going for here. Okay, so since now the states don't have to raise a military, they'll be saving so much money that they can spend it on just what he calls their civil list, or, you know, internal things, agriculture and manufacturers, basically. Excuse me, as he said before. In framing a government for posterity as well as ourselves, we ought, in those provisions which are designed to be permanent, to calculate not on temporary, but on permanent causes of expense. So again, if we're planning this government, we want this government to last forever, till the end of days. We need to make sure that it's open-ended enough where our posterity, our children, and our children's children may be able to continue to raise expenses as they have to. If this principle be a just one, our attention would be directed to a provision in favor of the state governments for an annual sum of about £200,000, while the exigencies of the Union could be susceptible of no limits, even in imagination. So no matter what you imagine, the federal government can keep going. The state governments, they won't need so much. Again, he's kind of just repeating the same stomping ground here. In this view of the subject, by what logic can it be maintained that the local governments ought to command in perpetuity an exclusive source of revenue for any sum beyond the extent of £200,000? Again, his capitals, not mine. Really interesting. He's really harping on this £200,000. Really, what else do you need? Why would you need more money than that? Which is fascinating. He's literally making the argument, we should never limit what the government can spend because we don't know what the future holds. Though why would the states ever need more money than they need right now? Cool, Hamilton, thanks. To extend its power further, in exclusion of the authority of the Union, would be to take the resources of the community out of those hands which stood in need of them for the public welfare, in order to put them into other hands which could have no just or proper occasion for them. So, in exclusion of the authority of the Union would be to take the resource of the community out of those hands. So, if we don't have the federal government raise all this money and we let the states just keep taking all this money they don't need, then the federal government won't have money to raise this army and the states are going to have all this extra money for seemingly no reason. Great. Let's see. This is one of the longer papers. I am going to put that out there. We're pretty well into it for me to say that, but oh well. Suppose then the convention had been inclined to proceed upon the principle of a repartition of the objects of revenue between the Union and its members in proportion to the comparative necessities. What particular fund could have been selected for the use of the states that would not either have been too much or too little for their present, too much for their future wants? A little tongue twisty there. So he's referencing the convention, the Constitutional Convention, what they called the Philadelphia Convention. So say they did decide to split the amount of money being raised very particularly. in proportion to their comparative necessities. So the states need this much for these things, federal government needs this much for these things. He's saying if you went about that system, then the government would fall short. Every government would fall short in certain areas and have too much in other areas. He's calling out bureaucracy, basically. Yeah, that's true, but it's kind of irrelevant to anyone's argument being made here. I don't know of any. I'm sure there were a few, but I don't know of any anti-federalists who are saying, well, we should have the very much raise the same funds and split it along the way. I don't. As to the line of separation between external and internal taxes, this would leave to the states, at a rough computation, the command of 2/3 of the resources of the community to defray from 1/10 to 1/20th part of its expenses, and to the union 1/3 of the resources of the community to defray from the 9/10 to 19/20 of its expenses. He's really getting boggled down in the fractions here for seemingly no reason. More or less, he's saying the same thing. We'd have the union, if we split the money fairly, then the federal government would not have the money it needs to do what it has to do, according to Hamilton, and the states would have way more money than they know what to do with. Sounds terrible. If we desert this boundary and content ourselves with leaving to the states an exclusive power of taxing houses and lands, there would still be a great disproportion between the means and the end. The possession of 1/3 of the resources of the community to supply, at most, 1/10 of its wants. So if the state governments were the only ones who got to tax people's property, then they'd have too much money and the federal government wouldn't. And when he's going through the means and ends here, he mentioned that in one of the previous papers we discussed, saying that, not like traditionally you hear the Machiavelli ends justify the means, and that's not what he's saying. He's saying if you have an end, you need the means to get there. It's not that the ends justify it, but if you get to an end, you need the means. And he's saying then the states would have way more means to get to their ends than they need, and the federal government won't have nearly the means to get to its end that they wanted. Got away from myself. If any fund could have been selected and appropriated equal to and not greater than the object, it would have been inadequate to the discharge of the existing debts of the particular states and would have left them dependent on the union for provision in this purpose. So if we could find a calculation that got the right amount of money to the states that they need and the federal government, then the states would be left without the ability to pay the debts they've accumulated through the Revolutionary War, and the federal government would have to dig into its own coffers to bail them out. He's saying that like it's a bad thing, even though just 2 years later he would absorb all the debts and make the federal government responsible anyway. Oh, Hammy, I'm on to you. The preceding train of observation will justify a position which has been elsewhere laid down, that a concurrent jurisdiction in the article of taxation was the only admissible substitute for an entire subordination in respect to the branch of power of the state of authority to that of the union. So his capital is not mine. Concurrent jurisdiction. He discussed this in the previous papers. The idea that both the states and the federal government can tax the people on the same thing. Many states, for example, have an income tax, as does the federal government. You can be taxed on your land or property you own from the states and the federal government. And he's saying right here that the only way we could accomplish what we wanted without having the federal government be the only one who can tax, no state taxes, only federal taxes, we could have done that, but we were nice enough not to. And therefore we have concurrent jurisdiction. We have to share the ability to do taxes. And I will once again remind you that 2 papers ago, he was talking about concurrent jurisdiction and said that sometimes it might overlap. And if that's too much for the people to handle, if the people can't pay twice, be taxed twice on one thing, well, then it's nice. The states should follow the policy of the federal government and back off. Policy. He capitalized policy. Anyway. Any separation of the objects of revenue that could have been fallen upon would have amounted to a sacrifice of the great interests of the Union to the power of the individual states. So if we didn't do it this way, if we didn't have concurrent jurisdiction, if we couldn't double tax the people, then the federal government that is trying to defend everyone would have to give up because the states want power. And yes, when I read this, I hear him whining like that in my mind. The convention thought the concurrent jurisdiction preferable to that subordination, and it is evident that it has at least the merit of reconciling an indefinite constitutional power of taxation in the federal government with an adequate and independent power in the states to provide for their own necessities. So, the Constitutional Convention, the delegates there, they thought that this concurrent jurisdiction, the ability to double tax individuals, was the best way to go about it because the federal government could get the money it needs, but also the state could get the money it needs. Federal government could get any money it needs to raise whatever money for whatever army it wanted, which Hamilton has argued in previous papers, and if you're new here, I suggest you go back and watch some of the old videos where we go through it very specifically. The federal government will be able to tax whoever it wants, whenever it wants, at whatever rate it wants, so that it can build the biggest army it could possibly build. But since the states can double tax you, they can also raise money for their own necessities. So it's the state's fault for the states to be able to do things like support agriculture and manufacturing. Well, they're double taxing you. It's the states that are the problem. Thanks, Hammy. There remain a few other lights in which this important subject of taxation will claim a further consideration. AKA, I'm going to talk about this more next time. Publius. Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. So we're going to pop back up to the big screen here. Just to summarize what we just discussed after reading Federalist number 4, it was Hamilton talking about more taxes, more taxes, more taxes. He kept repeating himself. He jumped around a lot, had a quick sojourn talking about ancient Greece. He's once again defending the idea of concurrent jurisdiction, the idea that both the federal government and the state government should be able to tax you on exactly the same thing. You should be able to be double taxed. And the reason you should be able to double tax is because the federal government is being a super nice guy and letting the states double tax you. Great. Either way, he once again demonstrates what he goes through fairly often in the Federalist Papers, that we need to have an army to protect ourselves. He does talk about something we haven't seen much of, which is planning for the future. When we create this government, we need to plan for the future, by which he means we cannot plan for the future. We can't know what we might know what 10, 20, 30 years down the road we might need to pay for, but we can't know 100, 200 years down the road. And he's right. If they planned in 1788 for World War II, we would not have done very well in World War II. We would not have had nearly enough money. They would have still been counting in pounds, probably. But he also goes into the idea that the most money from most major governments need to be spent on militaries. And he's essentially saying if the federal government takes over all the military spending, then the state governments won't need military spending, and therefore they can raise money to focus on internal improvements. He also does say that the state government shouldn't need a whole lot of money to do this, and he kind of calls them a little bit spoiled for even wanting the ability to raise more than 200 pounds, the number he seems to be stuck on. He then goes on to elaborate on, again, I will repeat, concurrent jurisdiction. It is the idea that you can be double taxed. It's not just double taxed. They will later on talk about the court systems, and there's concurrent jurisdiction in the court systems too. It's like if you commit a crime, you are in a state. Technically, county overlaps with state courts, and if you want to appeal a county decision, you go to the state, and if you want to appeal a state decision, eventually, in certain situations, it goes to the federal government. Technically, both court systems have say over you, depending on the crime you've committed and the level of appeal you've achieved. So it isn't just taxation, but that is the particular discussion that Hamilton's been having in these particular papers. And he will continue to go on, excuse me, and talk about it more in the future. Taxes. Speaking of taxes, as we wrap up here, you might have noticed I have not been publishing quite as many videos recently. I'm making some significant changes to Founder of the Day. I actually am doing a career change, and I am studying to take the enrolled agent exams, which is like Tax Preparer Plus. Partially, in no small part, inspired by these discussions we've been having reading through the Federalist Papers. I had worked in what we called accounts management for the United States Treasury Department for a few years, which in reality is the call center for the Internal Revenue Service. Yes, I worked in the IRS. And there I learned, I was able to help a lot of people resolve some tax issues they had, and I learned a lot about the language on the inside. So I am hoping over the next several months to pass several examinations and use that power to help taxpayers not only file their taxes, but as an enrolled agent, I'll be able to represent individuals in front of the Internal Revenue Service. It's like I'm a lawyer, but just for tax purposes. And actually, it's not just the IRS, it's all 50 states. So I am excited for this new change in my life, and I hope to help people when Hamilton's federal government comes calling, figure out how to best remedy any issues they come into in my particular community. On top of that, it is a lot of studying. I need to pass three-hour tests over the next several months. I've started studying just in the past week, and it is already fairly overwhelming. It is, as you might know, very complicated. TJ, thank you so much for your words of comfort. That being said, I'm going to put out a video elaborating on this more in the next few days. I will still be doing Federalist Tuesdays, and I'm thinking about adding Anti-Federalist paper read-alongs on Thursdays. The read-alongs are fairly simple for me. It doesn't take a whole lot of prep. I get the information, put it up on the screen, and I read through it and talk to you about it. I haven't been releasing founders every day for quite some time now, and I'm still determining exactly how to go about that in the future. I am going to do at least one a week, but I'm not sure if that includes, if I have to change the name of founder of the day, if I'm only doing them a few times a week, and especially because I've been focusing so much on Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, it's really something I've dug into. I hope one day to write a book on this particular topic after years of study, which you're studying along with me, so come for the ride. That being said, I'm not entirely sure what's going to happen over the next few weeks while my life kind of drastically changes. So, that being said, thank you for your support throughout this time. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a little something. I will put out that video in the next few days once I figure out what I'm going to say in it. And thank you so much. I am your humble and obedient servant, and I will be back with an Anti-Federalist paper on Thursday.